All right. Good evening. Good evening. I want to welcome you to a new study. We're going to be studying the book of Hebrews. And one of the first things you're going to notice is that I'm just about as smart as y'all. And my goal is to just walk through the book of Hebrews. I have done it once before. And when I looked at my notes, it was 10 years ago. And so it was fun then, and I do remember a lot of it. But it's going to be me going through the book again with you. And I'm going to teach this class a little bit different. I'm not a lecturer. So I'm going to request some participation from y'all. And I think that's how you learn a little better as we... since this is a class and it's an opportunity for us to provide feedback to each other and feedback for me, I like to consider myself, I'm just the facilitator of your discussion. Now, I will prompt you with some various questions and some things to consider and ponder and pontificate on, and then use your knowledge that you have. And you all are, like I said, about as smart as me, and so you've got a lot of knowledge of the Bible and how it all applies and ties into Hebrews, and I think it's going to be a good time. What I do have here is I do have a syllabus for the next, if you can believe it, it goes through June 18th. So from now until June 18th is when we'll be studying Hebrews. My goal is to take a chapter, half a chapter per week. So we're going to divide it up, and it's a nice divider of 26 weeks of the Hebrews chapter. So tonight is going to be just an overview. We'll do the overview, and then each week we'll be able to do I'm going to say a deep dive, but I'm going to say a medium dive. So you're not diving into the 20-foot side, you're diving into probably the 12-foot side on each of those chapters. And then again, I want you to use your knowledge and the information that you have, which is the same as I have, which is in the Bible, to go through the class together. So if I could get Carson to hand these out to everyone, it would be great. That way you know what chapter we're going to be on and what week we're going to be on. So that if you decide, which is cool, if you decide you would like to teach that class for me, volunteer, come on up. Somebody wants to take chapter 11 of Hebrews? Let's go. Somebody want to take chapter 5? I'm giving you an opportunity. Otherwise, I'll be up here doing it. So like I said, this is a participatory class, and I'll be asking you questions and asking you to discuss things between you all. And then we're going to end up, the end of the class will be another review. So tonight is a matter of, hey, how much do you know about Hebrews? Then we're going to dive into Hebrews for another 25 weeks. And then week 26, we'll come back and we'll go, how much did we learn? Okay? So let's go ahead and start that off. Let's start off with a prayer, and then we'll get started in our study tonight. Our dear Heavenly Father, we're going to thank you so much for this opportunity that we have to get together and open your word. We thank you for the folks that have gathered here to learn and increase their skills and knowledge in the words that you've given us. Thank you so much for your blessings that you've given us. Help us to help those who are in need. And we have quite a few folks that are in need due to the recent storms. Father, help us to continue to support them and build them up. We want to thank you for our health. We want to thank you for the opportunity that we have to speak to others about your word. We ask you to be with us as we go through this study and keep our minds open and our hearts ready. We pray all these things through Christ's holy name. Amen. All right. Any questions so far? Does that make sense on how I'm going to run the class? I mean, how you all are going to run the class? It's been a while since I've been up here. The last time I was up here, we went through all of the major prophets, which was also an enjoyable time for me to go through all of those and spend time with you there. So, the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews. Book of Hebrews chapter 13, verse 22 says, I appeal to you, brothers, bear with my word of exhortation, for I have written you briefly. The book of Hebrews is just an exhortation, short one. And when you think about it and you start getting into it and go, man, are you sure this is just a short exhortation? You're going to find that Hebrews is, as I like to say, it's going to be crunchy. You're going to be chewing on it. You're going to be pondering it. You're going to be spending time in it. And so that's how I kind of like to do it. But when you think about it, the author has presented it as a book of exhortation. Any comments or questions on it? All right. We're doing good so far. All right. So when we look at that, what I'll be doing for you on each one of these chapters as we kind of go through it tonight, I'm going to ask you for your favorite verse out of that chapter. And so that's part of the participation point, which would be, hey, I actually like chapter 5, and I like this verse specifically because it means what to me, right? So not only tell me what your favorite verse is, but tell me why that's your favorite verse. And I think that each of us can learn from each other that way and learn each other's perspective on it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the author. Actually, hold on. Michael, you had something to say about Hebrews.
I said there was a lot percolating in there.
Yes, there's a lot percolating in Hebrews, which is the name of my coffee shop later on. All right. So, thank you for that. I just wanted to make sure we got that out. So there is a lot percolating. The author. There are many options for the author, I guess. Can you think of any authors that were presented that could have written this book? Because what's interesting about this book is that the author does not name himself. So let me ask you this. Is that important, number one, that the author doesn't name himself? Is it important if we understand which of the various authors that they think they are? So who has an idea of an author that was named? Yes, Bobby.
According to history, it is thought that the Apostle Paul was the author.
Okay. All right. So we've got Apostle Paul. Luke. I've heard Luke. Yep. Luke. He hung out with Paul, right, as well. Anybody else? Barnabas. I've heard of Barnabas as well. Was Barnabas and Paul friends? Yes. Yes. Anybody else? Apollos? Yeah. What do we know about Apollos? He was an eloquent speaker, yes. He was an eloquent speaker. So you've got all of these various writers that are there. And then, this is the book we're using, by the way. If you don't have a book, let me know. I'll get you one. We've got like one per family. So if you need one, I'll get you one. In fact, you can have mine. I haven't written in it yet. Oh, actually, I did. I highlighted something. Hold on. You can't have this one. So we'll be using this book. This is a guide for you. And then I'm using another book as well. So this is a guide. We may or may not touch on some of the questions. I think there's some good questions in here. But it's a guide for you as we go through the study. All right, so this book spent 2 full chapters discussing the author and who could it be. So there's a lot of various things, right? So it could have been Paul. Paul lays out a lot of various logical arguments in his other letters. And then we talked about Apollos and his eloquent speaking, and then there was a couple other historians that might have been there as well. It was thought that Luke was maybe the translator of Paul, those types of things. And I think it's all cool. I think it's a great study to get into. But when it comes down to it, who is the author of Hebrews? God. Yeah. And that's, I'm like, okay, that's cool. It's got 2 full chapters. Let's talk about it all. But the author is God. And that's what we need to understand. And through the inspiration, it was written down for us by whomever God appointed as the writer. And that's my perspective on that whole discussion on the writer. Anybody have any other thoughts on that? It's Carson's favorite question, by the way. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on it? All right, so good. So we have the author. Like I said, I'm going to come to the conclusion the author is God, and then somebody penned it, which is great. How about the audience? Who is the audience of Hebrews?
Jewish Christians.
All right, Jewish Christians. Why would you say that? What makes you think that it's Jewish Christians, besides the title of the book?
Because of the things that are written, and it pinpoints pretty much pinpoints it says it when you go through the whole book.
Yeah.
I guess I'm not supposed to know that from the first chapter. I don't know.
No, that's good. We're just overviewing. So, yes. So when you look at the book of Hebrews, the audience that it's pointed towards are those who are well versed in the history of God, well versed in all of the things that had happened. So the idea would be that the audience understands who Abraham is, understands who Israel is, understands that Moses and Mount Sinai and the word was delivered there, understands that there was the Torah and the covenant, understands all of that, understands the priesthood and the sacrifice, understands the wilderness wanderings, and understands the promised land. So has a complete understanding of that entire history. And so that's what this writer is assuming already. And so for me, that's kind of neat for me because I might not be as versed on some of that cultural history other than what's written down in the Bible, right? But the people who are receiving this, they lived it. And so they've been living in it, and so that's what the writer assumes, that they understand that entire history. And that's when he dives in. So when he dives in, really, there's two main goals of the entire book of Hebrews. Let's see if you guys can help me out. What would be one of the goals of the book of Hebrews?
Supremacy of Christ.
Supremacy of Christ. Great. Why?
Because it starts out saying how great he is, how much better he is than even the angel, and he's the only one that was ever called God's son.
Okay. And so as we go through the book of Hebrews, right, we're going to understand why Christ is being elevated. And he's elevated from the first couple verses, right? And so part of that is if I'm of Hebrew origin or Jewish origin, why would that be important to me?
It's hard to let go of that old law. There's a better way now.
Right? And so you've been brought up in this old law the entire time, your entire culture and history and life and behaviors, right, has been brought up in that, and now you're being presented with what? There's something better? Which is pretty much the book of Hebrews. And if we had 10 minutes, then we could be done. Because that's really kind of what it boils down to. So it's going to go down to the supremacy of Christ, and what else? There's another one. What besides the supremacy of Christ?
Better sacrifice now.
Better sacrifice. There's a couple of chapters that we'll get into and some verses later on that talks about because of the supremacy of Christ, the goal is to remain faithful through the trials. Right? So as we think about what they're living with now, and we'll talk about when was Hebrews written, by the way? Yeah, somewhere like 65, 70, somewhere in there. What was happening during that time?
Persecution on Christians.
Lots of persecution on Christians, right? And so you've got the Roman rule still happening. You've got a couple rulers in there. Thinking written right around Nero time. Likely before the fall of the temple, destruction of temple. So you've got that timing. And so you're talking about two different things, right? So the supremacy of Christ and remaining faithful through the persecution. Yes?
Well, I was gonna say that there's big chunks of chapters that talk to them about their old people that they held in high esteem.
Yes.
By faith Abraham, by faith Sarah,
Mm-hmm.
by faith all these people. So I think they're tying in what the Old Testament was bringing forth and what Christ fulfilled in the Old Testament, and he's carrying on into the New.
Yes, yes, very good. Very good summary on that. Anybody else have anything?
It addresses a lot of their doubts.
Would address doubts.
People
Sure.
who were second guessing.
Yeah, it's tough times, right?
It addresses a lot of their doubts.
Because there might be some questions of those who are being persecuted as to why is this happening. Right? Anything else? Okay. All right, so good. So thank you for that. I think you're doing well. This is part of the feedback and part of getting used to talking with each other. Okay, so we've got that. We talked about the date, we talked about the themes. All right, so let's talk about kind of the structure of Hebrews. He calls it an exposition. And so when you're thinking about the various different chapters, there's always a reference back to an Old Testament concept or set of verses. And so the first couple chapters, chapter 2 and right around the middle chapter there's a discussion, brings up Psalms 8. So let's go to Psalms 8 and just let's read that real quick and see what that tie is. We're not going to go into Hebrews 1 tonight, but I just kind of wanted to start the conversation of each section, or almost every chapter, will talk about something from the Old Testament. And it will quote it. Will someone read Psalms 8, verses 4 and 6? Psalm 8, 4 and 6. Here's a participatory point. Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
What is a man that you take thought of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than God, and you crown him with glory and majesty. You make him to rule over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens and the fish of the sea, whatever passes through the paths of the sea.
Interesting. Okay. That verse is quoted in chapter 1. And so as we read about that, he's referring back to Psalms, and he's making an expository on it. And part of that first chapter is talking about introducing Christ. Would somebody read Psalms 95, Psalm 95, verses 7 through 11? Psalm 95, 7 through 11. So this would be a verse that is quoted in chapter 3, going into chapter 4. So whatever concepts that we'll cover in there, it's being mentioned. So it's good to go back and look at it. Psalms 95, 7 through 11. Who's got it? Okay.
For he is our God, we are the people of his pasture, and the sheep of his hand. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as at Meribah, as on the day at Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers put me to the test, and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work. For 40 years I loathed that generation and said, they are a people who go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. Therefore I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest.
I can't wait to get into that chapter. Right? So God is rebuking them. Right? And he's using Psalms 95 as part of that. So remember, I'm an audience of this letter, and I'm reading this, and I'm going, what? You're talking about the wilderness and about the rebellion? And yeah, I think that's kind of neat. So let me ask you this. If we're talking about the validity of the Bible, and you have the writer of Hebrews referring to Psalms, what does that do in your mind?
Encouragement.
It's encouraging. Who's the writer of Psalms? I'm sorry, who's the writer of Hebrews? God. He's referring back to his prior words. I'll make it easy. To me, that legitimizes all of the writings back then, right? Right? It legitimizes all the scripture, right? All the scripture from the beginning, and he's being quoted here in Hebrews.
It's not standing by itself, it's tied to the rest of
It's
the book.
tied to it, right? So when you think about the timing of Hebrews, somewhere 60, 70, and then that letter keeps circulating around, you're talking thousands of years, right? So for me, and this is just my personal deal, I guess, when I see scripture that's quoted in the New Testament, that's from the Old Testament, it legitimizes all of that writing, right? It also legitimizes the writer who wrote Psalms, right? God wrote it. David wrote a bunch too, from God. So, yep. So good. I like that. All right. So that's just a couple of things I wanted to bring to mind. There's one more I want you to read. Carson, would you read Psalm 110, verse 4? 110, verse 4.
The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are priests forever after the order of Melchizedek.
All right. So there's a section where we're going to try to understand where Christ came from. And there's a description of the priestly line. Right? So again, these folks understood the priestly line. There's Christ. And then there's this guy named Melchizedek. Right? And so when you think about where Melchizedek came from, we'll spend time there doing that. Where's he from?
Salem, but no beginning or no end to him.
Exactly. All we know is he came from Salem. And how was he appointed a priest? By God, right? So you've got this tie-in to discussion of Christ and the superiority, and then a tie-in to Melchizedek. So I think it's very interesting. We're going to learn a lot in here as well. So that's good. Any comments or questions so far?
I guess that's one of the very few, I'm not a real inquisitive person about always wanting to know more about stuff like some people are. I'm satisfied with what it says.
Yeah.
But this right here, if anything, Melchizedek is one of the things that I wish I knew more about that we're not told.
Yeah.
Because it's hard to fathom in my mind that he was a person and there's no beginning or end to him, and how that all fits in and ties to Christ. I know that's an example. Christ is the same way. He was from the beginning. But there's more. This guy was on earth and he was a priest, and that's one of the very few things. Like I say, I'm pretty satisfied with that. I'm not really curious about stuff that we're not told, but that's one that perked my curiosity.
Yeah, it is curious, right? And the fact that he's named.
Yeah.
And he's named in the Old Testament, right? So who paid tithes to Melchizedek? Abraham. So we're all the way back to Abraham. And now we're in Hebrews, and he's being referred to again. Right? And so I think that part is cool, because all of these people would have known in their writings who Melchizedek was, or they may have had to get reminded, like, oh yeah, I remember that guy. And then try to understand what his story was. And we don't know much other than he's named, and Abraham paid tithes to him, and he was a priest, a high priest. So, which is cool, because then you can get into this whole conversation about, so there was a priest before the Mosaic law. How did that happen? Okay, right? So, there you go. I'll just plant that right there, and you can ponder that for a while. That just tells you that there was a law before the Mosaic law, and it was God's law. All right. Okay, moving on then. So we've got that section there. So the first couple chapters, let's dive into the first couple chapters as an overview, right? So we've got the superiority of Christ, and it's through a different revelation, right? And so as you look at those first verses, we'll dive into those next week, starting next week. But you've got a new revelation and the superiority of God's new revelation and the superiority of Christ. And so diving through those chapters, you get an example of Christ being superior to the angels. And we can talk about that a little bit more, but I'll ask this question. Why would that be important? Have we ever met an angel? What would happen if you met an angel? I would crumble to the ground. Yes, I would crumble to the ground because that would make me fearful. And I think that if you ever, all of the ones that I've seen listed here, and we'll go into a study of angels, and we'll dive into that a little bit. That's like a whole big study in and of itself. But let's just say, for this matter, the angels are spiritual beings, okay? And then Christ being superior to them, okay? All right. And then you've got the concept that we shouldn't ignore the revelation that God has given us through Christ, okay? And that Christ was made like us. And so sometimes I still struggle with that, right? Christ being in the form of a man, going through the things that we go through every day. Even the kind of the minimal things that we do. You got to wake up in the morning, you got to fix your eggs or whatever you're eating, or probably eat some bread, and whatever the breakfast was, and then move on through the day. And all of those days, a lot of them happen that we don't know anything about. Right? We've got his birth. We've got kind of his little glimpse of the teenage years, and then you've got his ministry. A lot of in between that we don't know. But that's the part that kind of have a hard time wrapping my mind around, but we need to understand why he did it. Took on the form, left heaven, and became, as we'll learn later, that great superior sacrifice. Yes?
The things that we don't know or understand or not told, that's why we have faith.
Yes.
Because we have to believe things that we haven't seen. And our little human brains can't really comprehend how something can transform from God to man and then go back to the spiritual.
Yeah.
And we're just not made where we can really get that.
Yeah.
So that's why we have to have faith.
Yeah, and some of our minds grind sooner than others, right? Mine will grind pretty quick on some of that. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. And that's why there's a lot of things in the Bible, like when heaven is being described, it's being described in human terms that we can understand. We know what a diamond looks like. We know what a sapphire looks like. Those are things that we can kind of go, oh, wow, those are neat, and it helps us describe it. So good. All right, so as we dive into chapter 3, Christ is now being compared to superiority of who?
Moses, and that was probably difficult for them.
Yes. So we started with angels, and now he's being compared as being superior to Moses. Yeah, that would be a difficult thing, right? Having been brought up through the whole Mosaic law, the lineage, the priesthood, all of that, all of the celebrations and all of the things of remembrance that they had, those are all things that would be ingrained in your behavior and all of your actions. And so being superior to Moses was a big deal. And then also superior to not only Moses, but the priesthood as well. So the Aaronic priesthood. And so as you're looking at that, and then talks about Christ being the high priest, and then the higher or the superiority of the priestly order under him. Okay? Any questions on that? Like I said, this is just an overview tonight. We'll start diving into it next week. Any comments or questions?
It's interesting that, he's pointing out to them that this new law, this new sacrifice is better than the old sacrifice and the old law there in the book. And he gets to this part, and he says, Jesus is better than Moses. And at this point, we think we have Jewish Christians here, we think they know this, but I don't think, sometimes we know it, but we don't know it. And when they read that, they had to stop and pause and go, wow.
Was there a time when they talked about how Moses was great when Jesus was around? Who was in the Transfiguration?
Christ, Moses, and Elijah.
Christ, Moses, and Elijah, yes. Right? So Moses was a big figure. And so just think of when the disciples saw that, whoever was with Jesus at the time. That was a big deal. And even their minds kind of ground to a stop on that one, trying to understand it as well. So you're right. Trying to understand that Jesus is greater than Moses it's going to be a big thing. And so we'll dive into that. All right. Then you have the sacrifice. The sacrificial work of all of the priesthood and the high priest that was being done. And you've got Christ being showing the superiority of his sacrificial work versus the priesthood sacrificial work, if that makes sense. And that's kind of the high level of it. So there's a chapter 8 in there where it talks about, hey, the priests, they had to wash themselves and clean themselves every time they made a sacrifice. And it wasn't like it stuck. But with Jesus, he only had to do sacrifice once. The priests had to do it all the time, on a regular basis. There's sacrifices that were weekly, monthly, whatever they might be, yearly. Christ only had to make one. And that was the demonstration of his superiority of the sacrifice.
They had to make it for their own sins.
Yeah, so they had to do it for their own sins and then the sins of the people, right? So there's constant of that. So Christ's superiority of that. Excellent point. Thank you. All right. So you've got the better sacrifice. And then in chapters kind of 10 through 13, you start talking about the living faithfully part. So it's a call to follow Jesus faithfully with perseverance. And so knowing that a lot of people have put in effort and a lot of work for God as being part of the law. But then there's also, because they talk about the prophets, what happened to the prophets. And then, of course, bringing it to their current day where they're at, as they're being persecuted, there's some talk about how some were sawn in two. And some were done this and some were done that. And so you're talking about, there's a lot of persecution going on, and the idea is like, persevere through it and live faithfully, because if you do that, and there's a word in Hebrews that I really like, and it's called confidence. Living faithfully to be confident that you're going to get the reward. And then there's some other writings from Paul that talks about he's being confident. Even though he knows what he was in the past, he feels confident through the work that he's done for God and for Jesus and for spreading the word, that he is confident that he's going to make it. He's going to make it. And that's part of what we do too. If we do what God's asking us to do, we follow his commandments, we should also be confident that we will reap the rewards that God is promising us. All right, so we've got that. We've got confidence. So there's a concept of confidence to enter the sanctuary. Who could enter the sanctuary in the temple? Only the high priest, yeah. And so the high priest even had to do sacrifices to get in there. How many times could he go in? Once a year. Once a year. That means it's a pretty important day, right? So when you think about that, it's transferring to Christians, in this case, the audience that it's being written to. You should also have the confidence to enter the sanctuary as well. And so that tends to blow your mind as well. It's like, wow, that's actually a pretty high status that we have. And the value that God puts on us, that we can do that, to be confident. There's warnings. Also, there's warnings against persistence of sin. There's the concept of persevering through faith through pressure. Because there was that in the past, there's going to be more in the future. There's of course, there's chapter 11. Okay, so if you needed some encouragement, going through chapter 11 gives you, I don't know, it's kind of like the dream team, right? It's the dream team that's out there. And I guess when you look at, you guys already kind of know all that. So they know all of these people, right? They know every one of these people that is being named in Hebrews chapter 11.
All about all of the great faith.
Yes. And what I wanted to get to was, where is it? Yes, chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside. So there's encouragement, right? So think about all the witnesses that are listed in chapter 11 and how that relates to you. What a great opportunity. You're surrounded by these cloud of witnesses. Don't lose your focus. Right? Don't lose your focus. Good. All right, so there's encouragement to persevere through the face of hardship, and then there's exhortation for holy living, and then there's some more motivations and warnings. So, as we look at these, I want to just kind of step through it a little bit. So as we look at the various summary, we've got chapters 1 and 2, Christ's superiority over angels in the Torah. Chapters 3 and 4, Christ's superiority over Moses in the Promised Land. So there's a hope for a new creation. Okay. Chapters 5 through 7, there's the priesthood, a discussion about Melchizedek, so Christ's superiority over those. Chapters 8 through 10, there's a conversation about the sacrifice and the covenant. And so as you look at those layers, then you go through chapter 11, and you've got all of these folks that are mentioned there. You've got Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Israel, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Rahab. That's a pretty good list. And just to know that it gives us the opportunity to look at that and be able to improve our lives and understand what Christ's superiority over all of that. Okay, so there's something that I forgot to do. And we have about 6 minutes left. So I guess my question to you is, in chapter 1, does anybody have a favorite verse in chapter 1? Chapter 1, pick out a verse. What's one of your favorites? It's okay, there's only 14 to choose from.
I'd probably have to choose verse 5.
Verse 5. For to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my son, today I have begotten you"? Or again, "I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son"? Describing Christ, yeah. Good. Good. All right. I like that one. I like that one. I like verse 3, actually.
Two, three,
Yeah.
2, 3, 4, no, 3.
Yeah. It's hard to choose one, right?
2 and 3.
The radiance of the glory of God, the exact imprint of his nature. I like that too. How about chapter 2? Chapter 2, you have a favorite verse there. I've got a title heading that says, Warning Against Neglecting Salvation.
I like verse 1 where it says, do not drift away, because I think we can be lazy and not realize when we're moving away, but we do drift away.
It's an interesting word choice, right? Drifting. Right?
Just kind of doing nothing and sitting in a boat, you just drift away.
Drifting. And what's the direction of a drifting boat?
Yeah, that's where it is.
Right? Wherever the current takes it, right? Wherever the current takes it. And typically when I think of drifting as well, there's no steering involved. Right? So you got to be careful. You don't want to drift away. Okay, good. Anybody else? How about chapter 3? I like verse 1. Right? We're being called holy brothers who share in heavenly calling. Holy brothers. Yes, Michael, you were going to say something.
Interesting word choice. I like verse 14, but it's tied to 13, which says, "And encourage one another day after day, as long as it is still called today."
Yeah.
I find it interesting that it's worded that way. But the reason I like 14, because it says, hold fast until the end. I like that phrase, until the end.
Yeah.
You know, we don't give up and drift away. We got to hold fast until the end.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. Chapter 5. Verse 4?
No, I think we skipped 4.
Oh, I skipped 4? How would I do that? Let's do chapter 4.
Multiple times in this book, it talks about rest.
Mm-hmm.
And it does it in verse 4. Because I don't know if I'm always working, I'm always doing something. That thought of rest does seem very pleasing. And
Yeah.
it reminds us in the beginning to think about that.
Yes. You don't want to be here. You don't want to hear that. Don't enter into my rest. You don't get rest, right? I think verse 1 talks about it would be crazy if you missed it, right? Lest anyone should seem to have failed to reach it, right? Help each other out. Good. I'm sorry. How about chapter 5 now? Chapter 5.
When you say favorite, it's not my favorite verse, but it does sting. When you read verse 6, 4, 5, and 6, and it talks about people falling away, and it says, they have fallen away, it's impossible for them to renew again to repentance. And when you think about these people, the end is worse than the beginning. So it's not my favorite, but it is a verse that does
Yeah.
sting.
Yeah, it's another warning, right? Another warning. Good. I like verse 5. So also, Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed. Good. All right. How about chapter 6? How about we save that for next week? Very good. All right. So thank you for your participation tonight, and we will get into it next week, chapter 1. We'll probably only get through half of that chapter. That's the plan, by the way. So we're going to do kind of a medium, deep to deep dive.